Hello Year 8 and welcome to your first English video lesson of this 2-week school closure period. It's Mr. Cheetham here and I'll be teaching you a lesson about the Miller from Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, 32 characters make their way to Canterbury. They're all from different walks of life, however. Here are just a few of them for your do now. So you've got a knight, nun, monk, friar, cook, parson, miller, who's the subject of today's lesson, and a few others, etc., etc. So what I want you to do is, can you identify which characters might have the highest social status based on their profession, as in what they do? Which characters might have a lower status? And do you recognize all of these professions, or any of them? Can you think of any modern day equivalents for these professions? Some of them will be easier, some of them might be a bit harder, but you can use a dictionary or Google to look up the definitions of these if you need to. So pause the video here, take 5 minutes and answer those 3 questions. Okay, once you've done that, we can move on to the next slide. So, as I've said, today's lesson is to understand the main ideas in The Miller. We'll do this by reading the prologue and discussing some contextual ideas, and we'll do this to develop your understanding of medieval literature. So, we need to first understand what a miller actually is before we read about this particular miller. So, a miller is simply a person who works in a mill. A miller is a person who works in a mill. Now, a mill is a building equipped with machinery for grinding grain into flour. So that's what a mill is, and a miller is anyone who works in that building, doing that job. So write those down, because it's really important to understand who the character is and what he does for a living before we read about him. And I just want you to think about, what would be a miller's social status in medieval England? How would a miller, someone who does this job, how would they be regarded? Would they be rich, poor, somewhere in the middle? Would they be highly thought of by others? So just one full sentence. A miller's social status in medieval England would be, and then whatever your thoughts are. Once you've done that, we can move on. So I now want you to just mind map what sort of character you think the miller will be. Obviously, we haven't read about him yet, so we don't know for sure, but this is just a place for you to record any of your preconceptions about what he might be like, or just take an educated guess, really. So try and write down at least 3, maybe 4 things about his character, how you think he may be like, how you think he'll behave, sort of things he thinks and does. It can just be adjectives. So take 5 minutes now and pause the video here. Okay, once you've got 3 or 4 things on your mind map, we are going to read through a description of the miller. So, I'll read it. I just want you to keep in mind 2 questions that you'll answer after reading. First is, what are your first impressions of the miller? And the second is a similar question, it's, what sort of person is he? So what are your first impressions of him, and what sort of person does he strike you as? The miller was a chap of 16 stone, a great stout fellow, big in brawn and bone. He did well out of them, for he could go and win the ram at any wrestling show. Broad, knotty, and short-shouldered, he would boast he could heave any door off hinge and post, or take a run and break it with his head. His beard, as any sow or fox, was red, and broad as well, as though it were a spade, and at its very tip his nose displayed a wart on which there stood a tuft of hair, red as the bristles in an old sow's ear. His nostrils were as black as they were wide. He had a sword and buckler by his side, his mighty mouth was like the furnace door. A wrangler and a buffoon, he had a store of tavern stories, filthy in the main. He was a master hand at stealing grain. He felt it with his thumb, and thus he knew its quality, and took 3 times his due. He liked to play the bagpipes up and down, and that was how he brought us out of town. Okay, so that's the Miller. That's all we'll read for today. Remember, you can go back and look at those slides, as this is a video lesson, so go back as many times as you want. And I want you to answer the questions I told you about briefly before reading it, which are, what are your first impressions, and what sort of person is he? And you've got some sentence starters there to help you if you don't know how to start. So take a couple of minutes now and just answer those questions. Okay, once you've done that, you've got another task to do. So I want to think about what we can learn from the Miller, what we can learn about the Miller, from this description. So your task is to find quotations that tell you something about the Miller. So as I said, go back to those 3 slides where you read the Miller. But first, make a table like this on your paper or in your book, wherever you're working. One side for quotations that you'll use, try to have about 3, and another column for inferences that you can make from those quotations. So that's where you need to infer what those quotes tell you about the Miller. So I've provided an example. Don't use this one unless you're really stuck, but I've got an example quotation which is, "The Miller was a chap of 16 stone." Then on the other side you need to have your inference, so what you infer from this. I'm not going to give you that one, but we've got a sentence starter. So this suggests the Miller is something because something. Okay, so I'm sure you can work that out. So take 5, 10, maybe 15 minutes, however long you need now, to lay out that table in your book and get 3 good quotations about the Miller, and then 3 inferences for what they tell you about the Miller, what they suggest about him and what he's like. Okay, so take 5, 10, 15 minutes. Keep going back in the video and finding quotes. Okay, now I want you to draw an illustration using all the words and phrases you've noticed about the Miller. So using all of the words and phrases you have noticed, for example, the ones you put in your table, but not just those ones. Don't restrict yourself to those ones. Just any that you can find from going back in the video and reading the Miller. Draw an illustration of the Miller. Try to make it as accurate as possible. Label your drawing with quotations to show why you have illustrated him in that way. So if it's his big head that he uses to open doors, make sure you include an arrow and then a quotation which explains about his big head and why you've chosen to draw his head like that, for example. It also mentions his beard and other things like that. So make sure you're backing up your drawing with quotations. Try to make it accurate and realistic and as related as possible to the actual poem. So just draw that illustration here, pause the video, and draw a nice illustration of the Miller. And finally, for your review activity, I want you to create an acrostic poem or an acrostic to describe the Miller. Don't panic if you don't know what that is. The definition is there on the right hand side. An acrostic is a poem where the first letter of each line spells out a word. So I've given you an example there. If I was using the word friend, I might have funny for F, then real for R, interesting, enjoyable, nice, and delightful. And then if you look at the first letters of each word there, that spells out the word friend. So I've given you the letters of the Miller, M-I-L-L-E-R, and just think of any words you can think of that start with those letters that capture what the miller is like and really describe his personality. Try to have a really good think and capture his essence in just those 6 words. Okay, and then once you've done that, that is the